They are preparing for war. And this time, the warning comes from the most powerful military alliance in the West. For the first time in history, NATO has approved a historic increase in military spending. 5% of each member country's GDP must be allocated to defense. And this is not just another number. We're talking about over $1 trillion in additional funding every single year, aimed directly at strengthening Europe's military power and reinforcing the alliance, all in response to the greatest threat faced since the Cold War, Russia. This decision is a game changer. It marks the beginning of a new arms race, fully focused on the real possibility of a direct confrontation with Moscow. But what's really behind this massive budget increase? Why is this announcement a turning point in the relationship between the West and Russia? And most importantly, are we on the path to an inevitable war? You'll understand it all right now. What NATO is planning and why the whole world needs to pay attention. For decades, NATO set a minimum target of 2% of GDP for its member states to invest in defense. But in reality, that goal was ignored by much of Europe, especially by countries far from Russia's borders. The argument was always the same. Spending heavily on defense seemed unnecessary, expensive, and politically unpopular. Many believed the danger was buried along with the Cold War. But that illusion didn't last long. Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014 was the first clear sign that the Kremlin was still willing to use force to redraw Europe's map. And when Russian troops crossed into Ukraine in 2022, it became impossible to ignore. The threat wasn't just back, it was already on the move. Meanwhile, some NATO countries, especially in Eastern Europe, were already spending close to or above 3% of GDP on defense, but the rest of the alliance lagged behind, weakening the bloc and exposing major vulnerabilities. That's when the United States, under Donald Trump's leadership, raised the pressure. Trump was blunt, and for many, ruthless. Either Europe steps up to defend itself, or the US will scale back its military support. The message left no room for interpretation. The demand? A radical increase in defense spending. 5% of GDP from every NATO member, with part of that money going not only to weapons and troops, but also to the critical infrastructure needed to withstand a possible Russian attack. The result of that pressure is what we're seeing now, a historic turning point, with Europe preparing in a concrete, massive way for the worst-case scenario. And Moscow is paying attention. What stands out in NATO's new commitment is that it goes far beyond tanks, fighter jets, or boots on the ground. The decision to raise military spending to 5% of each country's GDP has been carefully divided into two major categories. 3.5% directed toward traditional military power, weapons, troop training, equipment maintenance, and strengthening each nation's armed forces. This is the classic investment in firepower, ready to be deployed on the battlefield if necessary. But perhaps even more surprising, 1.5% of GDP will be invested in less visible, yet equally strategic areas: critical infrastructure, cyber defense, and national resilience. This shows that NATO has finally acknowledged a harsh modern reality. A war against Russia, or any major aggressor, doesn't necessarily begin with soldiers marching across borders. It can start with the click of a hacker, the collapse of a sabotage bridge, or a blackout targeting key energy systems. That's why roads, railways, ports, pipelines, communication networks, and even field hospitals are now a priority for this multi-billion-dollar investment. The goal is simple: ensure that troops, equipment, and resources can be deployed quickly, even under attack. And beyond that, reinforce entire societies to resist sabotage, hybrid warfare, and cyber attacks, which today are as much a part of Russia's arsenal as missiles or tanks. This defense structure proves NATO isn't just preparing to respond. It's preparing to win from the very first second, or ideally to prevent the war from starting at all. Since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, the West has been witnessing a constant escalation in the Kremlin's aggressive behavior. And the war in Ukraine, which began in 2022, only confirmed what NATO generals had long suspected. Vladimir Putin is willing to redraw Europe's borders by force. For Eastern European countries like Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Russian threat isn't theoretical. It's a constant reminder. rooted in decades of Soviet occupation and the fear that history could repeat itself. NATO understands that if Russia strikes again, the first impact will be felt right there, at the doorstep of Eastern Europe. And this won't be limited to tanks crossing borders. The attack could come from all directions: sabotage of infrastructure, energy grid failures, cyber operations, and disinformation campaigns. That's why this new defense investment plan isn't focused solely on strengthening military forces. It builds a structural protection network to ensure roads, railways, bridges, and logistical systems are ready for rapid and sustained troop mobilization to the front lines. NATO's message is crystal clear. Hesitation now could mean losing territory, lives, and sovereignty in the near future. But Moscow has also responded. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov accused the West of launching a demonization campaign against Russia, claiming that NATO needs to invent an enemy to justify its skyrocketing defense spending. But with the world watching, the ongoing war in Ukraine, and Putin's open threats against Europe, that narrative is becoming harder and harder to defend. According to NATO leaders, what's truly at stake is the balance of power across the entire European continent. The approval of this new 5% of GDP defense target is not just an economic milestone, it's a turning point for the West. NATO expects that, combined, these investments will inject over $1 trillion per year into the military and structural capabilities of its allied nations. A massive financial commitment that, according to NATO leaders, could reshape the balance of power across Europe. But the challenge ahead is significant. Despite strong support from countries like Poland, Estonia, and other neighbors near Russia's borders, not all NATO members are fully aligned. Spain, for example, has already declared that it will not reach the 5% target, arguing that its current 2.1% contribution is enough. Other nations, especially in Western Europe, have expressed resistance, citing budget constraints and internal priorities. Even so, the message is clear. NATO will monitor, enforce, and demand results. Beyond that, the alliance is already working on another critical front: the defense industry itself. Western leaders now openly admit that current stockpiles of weapons, ammunition, and technology are insufficient to sustain a prolonged conflict with Russia. That's why NATO's latest summit introduced measures to fast-track military contracts, boost technological innovation, and guarantee superiority on the battlefield, whether in direct combat, cyber defense, or strategic infrastructure. The final message is blunt. The West can no longer rely on luck. Preparation must be complete before the next crisis erupts. Whether facing Russian threats, hybrid sabotage, or new forms of warfare, one thing is certain: the world has entered a new era, and Europe, by all indications, is preparing for the worst-case scenario. So if you want to stay informed about every detail of this growing conflict, understand global military strategies, and follow the behind-the-scenes moves shaping geopolitics, subscribe now to Global Defense Report. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next episodes, and we'll see you in the next videos.